Welcome to the war narrative where wars become stories. Wars between two of the world's most populated countries are rare. And yet, in 1962, such a war broke out, not in vast plains, but in a wilderness where every step felt like a struggle against the mountain itself. The clash came in the suffocating reaches of the Himalayas, where lungs burned, skin split in the cold, and exhaustion was as deadly as any bullet. On the surface, the Sino-Indian War of 1962 was brief, barely a month long. To outsiders, it seemed minor, a few thousand casualties, scattered fights along remote ridges. Compared to Korea, Vietnam, or the nuclear standoff in Cuba, it seemed almost unimportant. And indeed, in that autumn, as the world held its breath during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the thunder of artillery in the Himalayas went unheard. But for those who fought it, the war was unforgettable. For India, it was a national scar, a brutal reminder that idealism could not replace preparation. For China, it was a statement of power, proof that its new republic could bend the frontier to its will. The irony is stark. In the same days when Kennedy and Khrushchev waged nuclear war in the Caribbean, Indian and Chinese soldiers were gasping for breath, stumbling through rock and snow, and dying for control of valleys most of the world had never heard of. One conflict threatened the globe while the other redrew Asia, and history remembered only the first. Here lies our beginning, a war that should have defined an era, yet was swallowed by larger headlines. To understand how two ancient civilizations, newly free or newly reborn, came to blows, we must step back to the maps and ambitions that turned mountain passes into battlefields. As with so many post-colonial conflicts, the roots of the Sino-Indian War lay not in villages or valleys, but on maps drafted in faraway offices. British officials, with pens instead of rifles, carved borders across the Himalayas, a landscape many of them had never seen. To men in Delhi or London, it was a frontier of paper. To the people who lived there, it was the roof of the world, where the winds could strip skin raw and rivers carve deep scars through stone. In 1865, W.H. Johnson drew what became known as the Johnson Line, pushing India's claim far into the barren plains of Aksai Chin. Few British ever set foot in this salt desert. Yet its emptiness gave them confidence. The plateau could be claimed without contest, a frontier on parchment. Later, as the great game between Britain and Russia reached its tense climax, strategy outweighed pride. In the late 19th century, London offered a compromise, the Macartney-MacDonald Line, handing Aksai Chin back to the Qing dynasty to cool tensions. Beijing never formally responded. Ambiguity took root, and ambiguity is the seed of future wars. To the east, in 1914, came another stroke of the pen, the McMahon Line, negotiated between Britain and Tibet at Simla. It sliced through the thick forests of what is today Arunachal Pradesh. China, though present, refused to sign. The British enforced it anyway, leaving Beijing angry at the arrogance of outsiders deciding Tibet's fate. India would inherit all of this. Claims layered upon claims, contradictions buried in dusty archives, maps that did not match one another. The Himalayas, majestic and unyielding, became less a natural barrier than a chessboard of imperial worries. What Britain left behind was not a boundary, but a puzzle, jagged and unfinished. One day, India and China would try to solve it, not with pencils on survey maps, but with men, rifles, and blood in the snow. For generations, Tibet stood like a vast plateau kingdom suspended between worlds. Its monasteries crowned high valleys, prayer flags fluttered in winds that never ceased, and its isolation served as India's shield. Traders and pilgrims crossed mountain passes where every step was paid for with sweat and dizziness. But armies rarely stayed long in a land where even survival was a daily contest. The Qing dynasty had claimed Tibet as a vassal, though its authority was often more symbolic than real. Britain, gazing north from India, treated Tibet as independent or subject to China, depending on what suited imperial strategy. For the Tibetans themselves, this fragile half-independence gave them space to maneuver. The plateau endured as a buffer until the 20th century swept it away. In 1949, Mao Zedong's new republic turned its gaze to the roof of the world. By 1950, columns of the People's Liberation Army marched into Tibet, their boots crunching across high valleys where yak caravans had once been the only sound. To Beijing, this was reunification. Tibet was China's. To the Tibetans, it was conquest, the end of an order that had lasted centuries. For India, the fall of Tibet was like an earthquake in world politics. The buffer was gone. Where monks had once debated scripture, Chinese barracks now rose. Where caravans wound along ancient trails, new military convoys advanced, and every kilometer of road or garrison meant that the frontier was no longer shielded by culture and altitude. It now pressed directly against India itself. Jawaharlal Nehru still held on to his vision of solidarity, of Hindi Chini bye-bye. He wanted to believe that two ancient civilizations, heirs of the same Asian heritage, could live together as equals. Yet the signs were there. Chinese troops digging in at Lhasa, engineers carving roads through wastelands, maps redrawn without consultation. Tibet was more than a plateau lost. It was the unraveling of a dream. And for India, it meant that the future would no longer be negotiated in monasteries and palaces, but in the unforgiving corridors of power, and one day on the battlefield. When India rose from the wreckage of empire in 1947, it did so with scars still fresh. Partition, bloodshed, the weight of displacement. Yet at its helm stood Jawaharlal Nehru, eloquent, idealistic, convinced that India could be the conscience of the post-colonial world. He imagined his nation not only as a democracy in Asia, but as a guide for others finding their way out of imperial shadows. At the heart of Nehru's vision was China. He saw in Beijing a fellow traveler, another ancient civilization reborn, another victim of foreign domination, determined to claim its place in modern history. Together, he believed, India and China could stand as pillars of a new Asian century, balancing the Cold War blocs without belonging to either. India was among the first to recognize the People's Republic diplomatically. Nehru's speeches were filled with the language of brotherhood. Hindi Chini bhai bhai. The phrase rang out in newspapers, echoed by schoolchildren, painted across walls. When Zhou Enlai visited India, he and Nehru were photographed walking side by side, symbols of an imagined harmony. And for a brief time, it seemed possible. The two giants, long separated by mountains and buffer states, were now speaking of partnership. Ordinary Indians, weary of partition and conflict, embraced the dream. But dreams can be fragile. Even as slogans celebrated unity, surveyors and soldiers marked contradictions on the ground. In the northeast, the McMahon Line cut through territory Beijing considered southern Tibet. In the northwest, the Aksai Chin Plateau, remote, wind-scoured, largely uninhabited, was suddenly of strategic importance to China's road builders. Nehru, ever the statesman, believed that history, culture, and ideals could outweigh barbed wire and barracks. Yet Beijing's approach was different. They spoke warmly in conferences while steadily strengthening their positions on the frontier. The irony was cruel. At the very moment Nehru was painting a future of Asian solidarity, the reality beneath his feet was shifting. And when the earth shifted in the Himalayas, the cracks would spread far beyond Delhi or Beijing. Aksai Chin was a land most Indians had never heard of, a salt desert at the edge of the sky, where the horizon seemed endless and the ground itself shimmered with mirages. It was barren, lifeless, and unforgiving. Soldiers who crossed it described the silence as suffocating, broken only by the scrape of boots or the howl of winds that seemed to strip the strength from the body. To Delhi, this plateau was distant, far away, almost unreal. But to Beijing, it was essential. It was the bridge between Xinjiang in the northwest and Tibet in the south, two unstable frontiers that had to be bound together if China was to hold them. And so, in 1956, convoys of Chinese workers began a task that few thought possible: building a road across the emptiness. Bulldozers crawled over salt flats. Laborers blasted through ridges. And soon, a narrow ribbon of asphalt carved through the plateau. It was not just a road. It was an artery tying Tibet to China's core, ensuring supplies and reinforcements could flow swiftly where once only caravans and pilgrims dared. India learned of it only when the road was nearly finished. Reports trickled in. Chinese markers had appeared on territory Delhi claimed as its own. The shock in parliament was clear. How could thousands of men and machines build across Indian claimed soil without notice? Nehru's face, when confronted in debate, was a portrait of fury mixed with disbelief. For Beijing, the matter was closed. Aksai Chin was theirs. For Delhi, it was an insult that cut to the bone. The road symbolized something greater than asphalt and stone. It was China's declaration that maps meant little compared to what could be held on the ground. Strategically, it changed everything. What had once been wilderness was now a supply corridor guarded by troops. For India, it was proof that friendship and fine words could not halt steel and dynamite. The Aksai Chin Road was not merely a feat of engineering. It was a warning written across the desert. Whoever controlled the roads would one day control the frontier. And on that count, China had already won the first round. By the late 1950s, the tension in Tibet burst into flame. Guerrilla bands of Khampa horsemen struck at Chinese convoys, their rifles echoing through valleys where even sound seemed thin. They fought not only for land, but for monasteries, language, and the rhythms of life that the People's Liberation Army sought to dismantle. In March 1959, rebellion spread to Lhasa. Crowds gathered outside the Norbulinka Palace, determined to protect the Dalai Lama from rumored kidnapping. The city, once hushed by prayer wheels and chants, erupted with gunfire. Shells from Chinese artillery crashed into sacred courtyards, scattering monks and civilians alike. The uprising was doomed. Tibet's resistance, fierce but broken apart, was drowned in fire. And yet, in the chaos, one figure slipped away. Disguised as a soldier, the Dalai Lama left the palace under the cover of night. His escape was a journey of agony and faith, days of riding across icy passes, lungs aching, stomachs empty, guided by loyal escorts who knew each gorge and frozen trail. At times, the altitude made every breath feel like swallowing knives. At others, silence pressed so heavy that even whispers seemed a danger. After 2 painful weeks, he crossed into India. Nehru offered asylum, greeting not only a refugee, but the symbol of a nation's crushed spirit. To Tibetans in exile, it was salvation. To Beijing, it was provocation, proof that India was sheltering a figure they called a feudal lord, an enemy of the revolution. The fallout was immediate. Border skirmishes flared with new intensity. In Washington, the CIA quietly sent weapons to Tibetan resistance groups, transforming Tibet's tragedy into another front of the Cold War. And in Beijing, leaders marked Nehru's decision as betrayal. For India, the choice to protect the Dalai Lama was a moral stand. But it also marked the point of no return. What had been an uneasy frontier became a frontier of hostility. The mountains now carried not only soldiers and patrols, but the weight of a spiritual wound that could not be healed by negotiation. From 1960 to 1962, the frontier was marked by a strange rhythm. Bursts of gunfire in the mountains followed by polite smiles at conference tables. Each side carried maps. Each side traced lines across paper. But the lines never matched. To accept the Johnson line meant giving up Aksai Chin to India. To accept the McMahon line meant surrendering what Beijing called southern Tibet. The standoff was total. Meanwhile, on the frontier, tension had a human face. Patrols moved through empty passes where oxygen was thin, their packs cutting into shoulders, their lips cracked from dry winds. Sometimes, when rival patrols met, there was only a stare across a few meters of rock and silence heavy enough to rattle nerves. At other times, words were exchanged. Taunts, warnings, or even brief moments of human recognition. But always, behind the words, rifles hung ready. India's answer was the forward policy. New posts were planted deep inside disputed areas, sometimes little more than huts manned by a few dozen men. These were not fortresses, but symbols, stakes driven into the wilderness to prove sovereignty. Supplies came on mule trains or by parachute. For soldiers, every post felt like an island, isolated and exposed. Letters home spoke of nights without sleep, of men staring into the dark, convinced that shapes in the distance were Chinese scouts. In Beijing, suspicion hardened. The forward policy looked less like defense and more like intrusion. To Chinese leaders, Nehru was drawing a slow noose around Tibet, step by step, post by post. Diplomacy failed. Negotiations produced nothing but repetition, each side citing maps no one else accepted. And in the shadow of these failures, the soldiers remained, standing watch on empty slopes where silence was more dangerous than sound. By the spring of 1962, the truth was unavoidable. Talks had failed. Trust had evaporated. The frontier was no longer a dotted line on maps. It was a fuse, burning slowly toward war. By 1961, Delhi understood a bitter truth. India could not defend the frontier alone. The border stretched for thousands of kilometers, yet much of the Indian army still wore woolen coats suited for the plains, not the mountains. Units rotated through forward posts without proper food or weapons, surviving on airdrops and the sheer stubbornness of men unwilling to abandon their ground. To many soldiers, the real enemy was not the Chinese, but hunger, frostbite, and exhaustion. Nehru looked outward for help. The first call went to the West, Washington and London. Surely, he believed, the guardians of democracy would see India as a natural counterweight to Beijing. But American officials remained cautious. Nehru's insistence on non-alignment had long irritated them. To Washington, India was too friendly with Moscow, too unwilling to commit. Britain echoed this hesitation. Sympathy was offered, but rifles and artillery came too slowly. Frustrated, Nehru turned to the Soviet Union. History's irony was sharp. Only a few years earlier, Beijing and Moscow had marched together as communist brothers. But by the early 1960s, Mao and Khrushchev were locked in rivalry, each accusing the other of betraying the revolution. India now found itself in an unexpected position. Courted by Moscow not out of friendship, but out of spite toward Beijing. Soviet training missions and arms deals soon followed. In the Cold War's chessboard, the Himalayas became another square of competition. Washington watched India cautiously. Moscow leaned closer, and Beijing grew convinced that Delhi was aligning with its enemies. Meanwhile, Tibetan guerrillas, supplied by the CIA, continued their doomed struggle, turning Tibet into both a battlefield and a pawn. For the soldiers manning half-frozen posts, none of this diplomacy changed the daily grind. They still rationed biscuits and tea, still woke to winds that numbed fingers before a rifle could be cocked. Yet the politics above them were shifting fast. What had once been a local quarrel over maps and valleys was now tangled in the world's great rivalry. India's search for friends abroad had begun. But the search would not stop bullets when the storm finally broke. In Beijing, Mao Zedong was losing patience. India's forward policy, with its scattered outposts perched across contested ground, looked to him not like cautious defense, but like creeping aggression. Each new Indian hut planted on the frontier was, in Mao's eyes, a challenge to China's authority in Tibet. Mao's reply was blunt, as only he could be. Nehru wants to move forward, and we won't let him. You wave a gun, I wave a gun. We stand face to face, and each practices his courage. It was a philosophy he called armed coexistence. The border would not be resolved by negotiation, but by a staring contest backed with rifles, until one side blinked. Inside China's leadership, some counseled caution. The great leap forward had just ended in famine and chaos. The army was stretched, the people weary. But Mao saw opportunity. A clash with India could harden China's borders, rally nationalism, and show both Moscow and Washington that Beijing was not to be underestimated. On the frontier, the policy became reality. Indian soldiers described seeing Chinese patrols shadowing them silently, sometimes only a stone's throw away. The two groups would stand across from one another for hours, fingers hovering near triggers, the tension as sharp as drawn steel. No battle was declared, but the weight of conflict was in every gesture, every glance. For the men on the ground, it was a psychological war. Nights in forward posts were haunted by the thought that shadows in the rocks might be enemy scouts. Every cough, every spark of a cigarette, risked drawing fire. One Indian soldier later said, "We slept as if someone was always watching, because someone was." For Mao, this was no accident. He had shifted the contest from maps and letters to nerves and endurance. India, he believed, lacked the stomach for sustained confrontation. And if the time came when endurance was not enough, he was ready to prove that coexistence could turn in an instant into war. The summer of 1962 carried the smell of gunpowder long before the first guns thundered. Patrols clashed at Dola and Thagla Ridge, skirmishes brief but bloody. Each incident was like a tremor, warning of the earthquake to come. In Delhi, however, confidence lingered. Nehru believed China would not risk war. His commanders echoed that faith. Major General B.M. Call even declared that a few rounds fired at the Chinese would cause them to run away. It was a fatal misreading, spoken far from the chill and silence of the frontier. On the line itself, soldiers felt the truth more keenly. They lived in makeshift bunkers where wind howled through cracks, ration tins froze solid overnight, and men grew thin from altitude sickness. A march of a few hundred meters could leave lungs burning, heads spinning, and legs trembling as if made of lead. Every step became an argument with the mountain itself. Across the valley, Chinese camps multiplied. Their trenches deepened, their movements more confident. At night, Indian soldiers swore they could hear the scrape of shovels, the hammering of timber, sounds that told them the enemy was preparing to stay. The clash came in October. A patrol of 50 Indians found themselves surrounded by nearly 1,000 Chinese troops. Against impossible odds, they fought fiercely, holding out longer than anyone had imagined. But ammunition dwindled, bodies fell, and the survivors were finally crushed. When it was over, the Chinese buried the Indian dead with military honors. It was a gesture at once chilling and respectful, a reminder that this was not yet full war, but it was close. For Delhi, the illusion was gone. Courage on the ridges could not make up for weak strategy and poor preparation. The fuse had burned low, and the explosion was now certain. On October 10, 1962, an Indian patrol of barely 50 men advanced toward Dola. They marched with rifles slung and little more than hope behind them, hope that presence alone would assert sovereignty, that China would avoid escalation. Their commanders had assured them the enemy would retreat at the sound of gunfire. Instead, as the mists lifted, the mountains revealed a trap. Nearly 1,000 Chinese soldiers surrounding them. The air was thin, but what crushed the patrol was not altitude. It was the sudden weight of realization. They had been sent forward not as a strike force, but as bait. The fight that followed was brief but desperate. Outnumbered 20-1, the Indians fired until barrels smoked, until the recoil numbed their shoulders, until each burst of bullets felt like defiance rather than strategy. They held longer than anyone expected. Men collapsed from wounds, others from sheer exhaustion. But still they fought. At last the line broke. Survivors scattered or were captured. Dozens lay dead among the rocks, their blood mingling with meltwater streams that trickled down the slope. And then came a moment that stunned even the survivors. The Chinese buried the Indian fallen with military honors. Graves were marked. Salutes were given. It was as if to say, "We respect your courage, but this land is ours." In Delhi, the news was received with disbelief. The skirmish proved beyond doubt what soldiers already knew. The Chinese were prepared, disciplined, and ready to fight. The old claim that they would scatter at a warning shot now sounded like mockery. Historians would later call Dola the final warning, a moment when war might still have been avoided. But by then, the powder keg was primed. The patrol's sacrifice became the spark. The storm was no longer approaching. It was here. Only days after Dola, the world's gaze swung thousands of miles away. On October 16, 1962, U.S. reconnaissance planes revealed Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. In an instant, every headline screamed of apocalypse. Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged threats, fleets mobilized, and television anchors spoke as if the end of the world were near. For nearly 2 weeks, humanity's breath caught in its throat. Children in America practiced duck and cover drills. Soviet submarines prowled the Atlantic. The eyes of the globe were fixed on Havana and Washington, on Moscow and the Caribbean Sea. And while the world trembled on the edge of nuclear war, another war was already being fought in valleys the world scarcely knew. On the high frontier between India and China, patrols exchanged fire, convoys fell back, and soldiers struggled against more than bullets. They battled hunger, frost, and the grinding fatigue of mountains that punished every mistake. It was a cruel irony. The Cuban Missile Crisis overshadowed everything, muting the thunder of artillery in the Himalayas. Had the superpowers not been so consumed by their own standoff, perhaps they might have pressed Delhi or Beijing to stand down. Instead, the mountains became a stage abandoned to its actors. For China, the timing was perfect. Under cover of global distraction, Beijing prepared to strike without fear of foreign interference. Mao saw clearly. If there was ever a moment to teach India a lesson, it was now. While the world's great powers were paralyzed elsewhere, the stage was set. The world held its breath for Cuba, unaware that in the Himalayas, war was already breaking loose. At dawn on October 20, 1962, the silence of the frontier broke. From the ridges above the Namkachu River, bugles pierced the thin morning air, and mortars roared. Thousands of Chinese troops surged forward, their movements rehearsed, their confidence unmistakable. The offensive had begun. The Indian defense was fragile from the start. Barely a battalion held the river line, undermanned, short on supplies, and armed with weapons more suited to parades than pitched battles. Commanders assumed the Chinese would storm the bridges, predictable choke points. But the PLA refused to play by the script. Taking advantage of the shallow waters of the season, Chinese regiments simply waded across the river, flanking the defenders and striking from directions no one expected. For the Indian soldiers, the shock was total. Positions meant to hold for days crumbled within hours. Units fought desperately, some emptying magazines until their rifles clicked dry, others retreating in chaotic bursts under the whistle of incoming fire. Men staggered into Bhutan, breath ragged, uniforms torn. The Chinese, disciplined and deliberate, stopped at the border and did not pursue, showing that every move was calculated, not reckless. And in the west, the storm was even larger. In Aksai Chin, 40,000 Chinese soldiers advanced against thin strings of Indian posts. Many garrisons were no more than a dozen men in stone shelters. Radios went silent one by one as positions were overrun. Survivors later recalled the strange feeling of being swallowed whole, the plateau stretching endlessly while enemy columns seemed to appear from the very horizon. In Delhi, disbelief turned to dread. Only days earlier, officials still spoke of deterrence, of warning shots being enough. Now, reports poured in of defeats, retreats, and collapsing lines. It was no longer about maps or symbols. It was war, and India was unprepared. The first blows belonged entirely to Beijing. And yet, amidst the chaos, Indian soldiers showed stubborn courage. They fought until surrounded, until ammunition failed, until frost and fire alike forced them back. The tragedy was not the absence of bravery, but that it was asked to stand alone, without the weight of preparation behind it. While the fighting at Namkachu shocked Delhi, an even greater disaster was unfolding to the west, in the empty wilderness of Aksai Chin. Here, the land was as unforgiving as any enemy. Salt flats stretching to the horizon, winds that stripped warmth from the body, nights so cold that men woke with ice stiffening their blankets. Yet this wasteland was no void. It was the lifeline of China's new frontier, the corridor binding Xinjiang to Tibet. On October 19th, Beijing unleashed the full weight of its forces. 40,000 Chinese soldiers advanced in coordinated columns, descending upon India's scattered garrisons. Many Indian posts were nothing more than stone bunkers manned by 20 or 30 men, supplied by mule trains that rarely arrived on time. Against the PLA's artillery and waves of infantry, they were swallowed almost instantly. By October 22nd, silence fell across the wireless network. Outposts north of Chushul were gone, their defenders dead, captured, or retreating in long columns through dangerous passes. Men trudged with blistered feet, rifles slung loosely, some carrying wounded comrades across shoulders. One survivor later recalled, "The plateau felt endless. No cover, no hope, just the enemy at our backs and the mountains closing in." And yet, scattered moments of defiance remained. Small groups fought to the last bullet, holding hillsides until their positions were drowned in fire. Their courage slowed the advance, but only briefly. By October 24th, Beijing held the upper hand everywhere. Then, with startling swiftness, the tone shifted. Zhou Enlai presented Nehru with a ceasefire proposal. Both sides would withdraw 12 miles from their current positions. China would fall back north of the McMahon Line in the east, and neither would cross new lines of actual control. It was diplomacy sharpened like a blade. Having seized ground in Aksai Chin, China could now afford to appear generous. To Delhi, the offer was a humiliation disguised as compromise. Accepting meant admitting India's losses were permanent. In Parliament, anger erupted. Nehru faced furious opposition, the cry rising that India must fight, not bargain. A national emergency was declared. And yet, behind the speeches, Delhi's leaders knew the truth. The enemy had momentum, and India's army was bleeding on the roof of the world. By late October, India's frontier was collapsing. Posts had fallen. Territory in Aksai Chin lay firmly in Chinese hands, and eastern defenses strained under pressure. Yet, even as soldiers staggered back through high passes with frostbitten hands and hollow eyes, Delhi was gripped by a different storm, one of politics and pride. Zhou Enlai's ceasefire proposal reached Nehru like a poison cup. On the surface, it promised balance. Mutual withdrawals of 12 miles, Chinese retreat north of the McMahon Line. But beneath it lay Beijing's true victory. In Aksai Chin, current positions meant China kept its road, its gains, and its leverage. To accept was to make defeat official. In Parliament, fury exploded. Opposition leaders denounced Zhou's offer as a trap, while newspapers branded it a humiliation too great to bear. Nehru, once hailed as a visionary, now stood under fire in his own house. He declared a national emergency on October 26th. The chamber erupted with applause and chants. India would resist whatever the cost. For a nation bruised by retreat, the words offered a measure of comfort. Yet on the ridgelines, words meant little. Soldiers dug trenches with numb hands, patched winter coats with scraps of cloth, and rationed bullets as if each one were gold. Some had not received new supplies for weeks. Others scrawled farewell notes on scraps of paper, unsure if they would ever reach home. The West, long hesitant, now stirred. Rifles and ammunition trickled in from the United States and Britain. But the irony was bitter. Aid arrived when India was already on the defensive, too late to change the momentum. Still, the declaration of resistance mattered. For the first time since the conflict began, Delhi spoke with one voice. Pride, anger, and desperation fused into a single demand. The invader must be cast out. The question was no longer whether India had the will. It was whether the nation had the means. On November 14, 1962, Nehru's birthday, India tried to strike back. At Walong in the eastern sector, Indian troops launched a counterattack meant to prove that the army would not only retreat, but fight. The men advanced through dense forest, their uniforms soaked with rain, rifles heavy with mud. They fought with amazing bravery, storming Chinese positions, hurling grenades until their arms ached. For a few hours, hope flickered. Lines shifted, and it seemed that courage might carry the day. But the Chinese were dug in, reinforced, and waiting. The counterattack bled itself out. Walong fell, leaving the ground covered with bodies. Survivors stumbled back into the jungle, dazed and hollow-eyed. Far to the west, the focus shifted to Chushul, the gateway to Ladakh. If Chushul collapsed, India's hold on the entire region could crumble. Indian engineers and soldiers worked feverishly, turning bare slopes into crude fortifications. Barbed wire curled across ridges. Sandbags rose into bunkers. At night, men whispered prayers by dim lanterns, knowing they were preparing not just to fight, but to die. The battle came on November 18th. Chinese artillery shook the valley, and waves of infantry advanced against positions at Gurung Hill and Rezang La. At Rezang La, a company of barely 120 Indians held their ground against thousands. Ammunition dwindled, then vanished. Men fought with bayonets, with rocks, even with bare hands. When silence finally fell, 114 Indians lay dead where they had stood, weapons still in their grip. The Chinese, impressed, buried them with honors. Rezang La became a legend, proof that courage could defy numbers, even if it could not change the outcome. Elsewhere in Chushul, the pattern repeated. Overwhelming Chinese numbers, heroic Indian resistance, and the slow collapse of defenses. Soldiers withdrew across frozen gullies, some carrying wounded comrades on makeshift stretchers, others leaving behind the bodies of friends because there was no strength left to carry them. For Delhi, the November battles were heartbreaking. Yet for India's people, stories of Walong and Rezang La were not tales of defeat, but of sacrifice. They became the kind of memories a nation builds its strength upon, grim, proud, and unforgettable. By the end of November, the truth was undeniable. India's army had been outnumbered, outsupplied, and outmaneuvered. The only question that remained was how much farther China would choose to go. By the third week of November, India was at the breaking point. Units were scattered, ammunition was dwindling, and the winter closing in promised to finish what bullets had not. Nehru, the architect of Hindi Chini Bye-Bye, now sent urgent appeals abroad. In desperation, Delhi even requested American air support, a plea so dire that the carrier USS Kitty Hawk was ordered toward the Indian Ocean. And then, without warning, Beijing ended it. On November 19, 1962, China declared a unilateral ceasefire. Guns fell silent, not because India had pushed back the advance, but because Mao had chosen to stop. The move stunned Delhi. For weeks, the PLA had driven relentlessly forward, seizing posts, routing garrisons, and carving deep into Indian-held land. Now they pulled back from much of Arunachal Pradesh, withdrawing almost as swiftly as they had advanced. But in Aksai Chin they stayed. The road linking Xinjiang and Tibet remained under their control. Beijing had taken what it truly wanted, and nothing more. Why stop? For Mao, the war had already achieved its purpose. India had been humiliated, its weaknesses exposed before the world. The PLA had demonstrated its reach, its readiness, its discipline. By halting voluntarily, China could cast itself as restrained, punishing but not expansionist. It was a lesson delivered with ruthless precision. Beijing would strike when challenged, but only on its own terms. With the soldiers retreating through mountain passes, the ceasefire felt unreal. One day they braced for destruction. The next they were told to halt, to stand down. Some collapsed in relief. Others wept in bitterness. Letters found later in abandoned posts spoke of shame more than fear. We did not lose courage. We lost because we were left with nothing to fight with. In Parliament, Nehru's voice was heavy with defeat. The dream of Asian solidarity was gone, replaced by silence and blame. He had believed diplomacy and ideals could hold the frontier. The war had proved otherwise. The ceasefire left no treaty, no reconciliation, only a line scratched across the mountains, fragile and unresolved. And though the fighting stopped, the wound it left in India's pride and in Sino-Indian relations would not heal so easily. The Sino-Indian War of 1962 lasted scarcely 5 weeks. By the measure of global conflicts, it was small. A few thousand casualties, no bombers over capitals, no formal declaration of war. Yet its consequences were vast, shaping the destinies of both nations for generations. For India, it was a national trauma. The loss stripped away illusions of security and shattered the aura of Jawaharlal Nehru. The statesman who had once spoken of Asian solidarity now faced his people with a voice heavy from defeat. The war left scars, not only on territory, but on memory, proof that ideals without strength could not hold the frontier. In its wake, India poured resources into its army, forged new alliances, and began the path toward nuclear weapons. Out of humiliation grew a determination. Never again would India be caught so unprepared. For China, the conflict was a calculated success. By striking hard and then pulling back, Beijing secured what it wanted: Aksai Chin and the road binding Xinjiang to Tibet, while presenting its withdrawal elsewhere as proof of restraint. To the outside world, it could claim it had taught a lesson but avoided conquest. To its own people, it showed strength and resolve, rallying nationalism at a time of internal strain. But the greatest legacy was the frontier itself. The ceasefire left behind the line of actual control, not a true border, but a line of patrols, suspicion, and shifting claims. Decades later, soldiers from both nations would still face each other there, sometimes clashing with stones and fists rather than rifles. Reminders that the War of 1962 had never fully ended. Beyond world politics lay the deeper tragedy. Two ancient civilizations, emerging from the shadows of colonialism and revolution, might have walked a path together. Instead, mistrust and pride drove them apart. Where Nehru had dreamed of brotherhood, there was only silence, punctuated by the echoes of artillery in the high passes. History remembers 1962 as the year the world nearly ended in Cuba. But on the roof of the world, another story unfolded, less visible but no less deep. The mountains still keep its memory, not only of shots fired, but of hopes buried beneath snow and stone. The border froze in 1962, and in many ways it has never thawed.